Once upon a time in a busy city, there was a wealthy family. The parents, Mr. and Mrs. Peter, were always working hard to make money and grow their business. They lived in a big house and had everything they could ever want except time for their only child, a little boy named Oliver. Oliver was only 8 years old, but he often felt very lonely. His parents were never around to play with him or listen to his stories. Oliver's parents loved him, but they were so focused on work that they didn't notice how sad he had become. Every morning, they rushed off to their offices, leaving Oliver with the house help. They had a routine of dropping him off at his grandmother's house whenever they had long trips or very busy work schedules, but Oliver dreaded going to his grandmother's place. His grandmother, Mrs. James, lived alone in a beautiful house at the edge of town. She was a tall, elegant woman with silver hair and always wore the finest clothes. She had been single for over 30 years after her husband passed away. Even though she seemed friendly and caring to everyone else, Oliver knew that there was something different about her, something that made him uncomfortable. Every time Oliver's parents told him he would be staying with Grandma James, his heart sank. "But I don't want to go," he would tell them. "Can't I stay here with the house help?" But his parents would always say the same thing, "Your grandma loves you. You should be happy to stay with her. We'll be back before you know it." So off Oliver went, feeling helpless. At first, his grandmother welcomed him with open arms, cooking him nice meals and buying him toys. But as soon as the sun set and the house became quiet, her kind smile disappeared. She began treating Oliver differently in ways that made him feel uneasy and scared. He didn't know how to explain it, but something was very wrong. She would hold him too close, kiss him on the lips, and caress his back, and sometimes do more things that made him want to cry. The boy didn't know how to tell his parents about it. Whenever they came to pick him up after their long trips, they were too tired to listen to him. "I don't like staying at Grandma's house," he tried to say once, but they brushed him off. "Oliver, we're doing this for you. We're working so you can have a good life. Now be a good boy." Oliver knew his parents loved him, but they never had time to hear him out. The grandmother, on the other hand, always acted sweet and caring in front of them. "He's such a joy to have around," she would say, smiling brightly. Oliver hated those moments because no one could see what was really going on. At school, his teachers noticed that Oliver wasn't the cheerful boy he used to be. He became quieter, sadder, and often sat alone during playtime. His friends would ask him to join their games, but Oliver just didn't feel like playing anymore. His heart felt heavy with a secret he didn't understand. He knew what his grandmother was doing was wrong, but he didn't know how to stop it. She always told him, "Don't tell anyone, Oliver. This is our little secret. If you tell, no one will believe you. They'll think you're lying." And so Oliver stayed silent. He thought maybe his parents were too busy to help him, and he felt completely alone. The more time he spent at his grandmother's house, the worse it got. The nights were the hardest. He would lie awake hoping for the sun to rise quickly so that he could go back home. One day after a particularly long stay at his grandmother's, Oliver sat by the window of her house, looking out at the world. He watched other children playing outside and wished he could be like them, carefree and happy. But instead, he felt trapped in a world where no one seemed to care about his pain. Grandma James continued her life as though everything was normal, always wearing her fancy clothes and acting like the perfect grandmother in front of others. But when it was just her and Oliver, she was different. Oliver knew he needed to do something, but he didn't know what. At school, Oliver's behavior grew even more unusual. He wasn't just quiet anymore. He looked tired all the time, as if he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were always neat and clean, but his eyes looked empty, and his smile had disappeared. His teachers started to worry about him. One day, Mrs. Jack, his class teacher, asked him to stay after class. "Oliver, is everything okay?" she asked, her voice soft and kind. She knelt down to his level, trying to meet his eyes, but Oliver just stared at the floor. He didn't know how to answer her. He felt ashamed, confused, and scared. What if no one believed him? What if his parents got angry with him for saying something bad about his grandmother? "I'm fine," Oliver mumbled, barely loud enough to hear. Mrs. Jack wasn't convinced. She had seen this kind of sadness before in other children. She knew that something was wrong, but without Oliver saying anything, she couldn't do much to help. She let him go, hoping he would open up later, but for now, Oliver remained silent. At home, his parents barely noticed the changes in him. They were always in a rush, preparing for the next business trip or meeting. When Oliver tried to talk to them, they were too busy or too tired to listen. "Not now, Oliver," they would say. "We'll talk later," but later never came. One night, while lying in bed at his grandmother's house, Oliver couldn't take it anymore. He felt trapped, like he was in a cage. His chest felt tight, and tears welled up in his eyes. He thought about running away, but where would he go? He had no one else to turn to. His parents were never there, and his grandmother made sure to keep their secret hidden. "Don't tell anyone, Oliver," she would say with a sweet but threatening smile. "No one will believe you." Oliver hated those words. They made him feel so small, like he didn't matter. He wished he could scream, but instead, he cried quietly into his pillow, hoping the morning would come soon. The next day at school, he sat alone during lunch, poking at his food. His friends noticed that something was wrong. "Oliver, do you want to play with us?" one of the boys asked, but Oliver just shook his head. He didn't feel like playing. Nothing seemed fun anymore. One of his friends, a girl named Grace, sat down beside him. "You look sad all the time now," she said, her voice full of concern. "Are you okay?" Oliver wanted to tell her the truth, but the words wouldn't come out. He didn't know how to explain what was happening to him. He just nodded and said, "I'm fine," even though he wasn't. One evening, as Oliver was getting ready for bed at his grandmother's house, she came into his room with that same fake smile. Oliver's heart started to race. He knew what was coming, and he hated it. His body felt heavy with fear, but he didn't know how to stop her. He felt powerless, like no one in the world could help him. "Be a good boy, Oliver," his grandmother whispered as she sat on the edge of his bed. "Remember, this is our secret. Now lie down on the bed and take off your pants." Oliver's heart beat fast. His grandma was going the extra mile this time. Usually, she kisses and caresses, now she wants him to lie naked on the bed. Oliver swallowed his breath and said, "Grandma, please." "Grandma, I don't want to. I don't like it." Then his grandma replied harshly, "Get on the bed now and take off your pants, or else I will deal with you." Oliver, crying, got on the bed and started crying, but his grandma didn't care. When she was done with him, she threatened, "If you tell anyone, they will never believe you. So make sure you keep quiet." Then she left. Oliver felt trapped. He wished he could disappear, run away, or just wake up from this nightmare. But instead, he closed his eyes, hoping that it would all be over soon. As the days went by, Oliver became more and more withdrawn. He hardly spoke to anyone at school, and even his teacher, Mrs. Jack, noticed that he was getting worse. She wanted to help, but Oliver never told her what was wrong. One afternoon during recess, Mrs. Jack watched Oliver from a distance. He wasn't playing with the other kids like he used to. Instead, he sat alone, staring at the ground. She knew that something had to be done, but without any proof or a confession from Oliver, it was difficult to act. Oliver, meanwhile, felt like he was sinking deeper into darkness. His grandmother's words echoed in his mind every night, "This is our little secret." He didn't want it to be a secret anymore, but he was too afraid to speak up. What if no one believed him? What if his parents blamed him for causing trouble? He tried to drop hints to his parents, saying things like, "I don't want to go to Grandma's house anymore," but they didn't take him seriously. Quote, "Grandma loves you," they would say. "You should be grateful to have her in your life." Oliver's heart ached with the weight of the secret he was carrying. It felt like he was carrying a heavy load that no one else could see. He didn't know how much longer he could keep it inside. Every night was filled with fear and sadness, and every morning he woke up feeling even more alone. But things were about to change soon. Oliver would find a way to tell the truth, and when he did, everything would finally start to unravel. One sunny morning, Oliver arrived at school feeling the same heavy weight on his heart. He had grown used to the sadness, to the feeling of being trapped in a world where no one could see or hear him. His nights at his grandmother's house were filled with fear, and his days were filled with silence. He had stopped trying to tell his parents how much he hated going to Grandma James's house because they never listened. But on this day, something was different. As Oliver walked into his classroom, he noticed a new person standing at the front of the room. It was a tall woman with a kind smile, dressed in bright, colorful clothes. She looked calm and friendly, and the other children were whispering excitedly about her. "Who's she?" Oliver asked one of his classmates. "She's a guest speaker," his friend replied. "She's here to talk to us about something important." Oliver didn't think much of it and quietly sat down at his desk. His mind was still clouded with worry about his next visit to his grandmother's house. But as the woman began to speak, something inside Oliver stirred. "Good morning, children," the woman said with a warm, gentle voice. "My name is Mrs. Ah, and I'm here to talk to you about something very important, your safety. You see, every child has the right to feel safe and happy. No one, not even someone in your family, should make you feel uncomfortable or scared." Oliver looked up at her, his heart beating faster. She continued speaking, explaining things in a way that was easy to understand. She talked about how sometimes people can do things that aren't right, even if they pretend to care about you. Mrs. Ah told the children that their bodies were their own, and no one had the right to touch them in ways that made them feel bad. If anyone is touching you in a way that makes you feel sad, scared, or uncomfortable, she said, you should tell a trusted adult. It could be a teacher, a parent, or even someone here at school. We're here to help you. You don't have to keep it a secret. The word, secret, made Oliver freeze. His grandmother's voice echoed in his mind. This is our little secret. For so long, Oliver had believed he had no choice but to keep silent. But now, for the first time, he heard someone say that keeping such a secret wasn't right. Mrs. Ah then said something that made Oliver's heart race even more. And if you're ever afraid to speak up, remember that we will believe you. We will listen to you, and we will protect you. Oliver could hardly breathe, his thoughts were spinning, and he felt a mix of fear, confusion, and hope. What if someone did believe him? What if telling the truth could finally end the nightmare he was living? After the talk, Mrs. Ah asked the children if they had any questions or if anyone wanted to talk privately. Some children raised their hands and asked questions about feeling safe and what to do if someone tried to hurt them. Oliver stayed quiet, his heart pounding in his chest. When the bell rang for recess, Oliver stayed in his seat, watching as the other children rushed outside to play. He felt like something inside him was pulling him in two directions. One part of him wanted to keep quiet, like he had always done, to keep the terrible secret his grandmother forced him to carry. But another part of him, the part that had listened to Mrs. Ah, was telling him that maybe, just maybe, it was time to speak up. As he sat there lost in thought, his teacher, Mrs. Jack, approached him. Oliver, do you want to talk? She asked gently. Oliver hesitated, his throat felt dry, and his hands were trembling. He didn't know how to start. What if no one believed him? What if his grandmother found out he had told? But then he remembered Mrs. Ah's words, we will believe you. With a shaky voice, Oliver finally spoke. Mrs. Jack, I don't like going to my grandmother's house. Mrs. Jack looked at him with kind eyes. Why, Oliver, is there something happening that's making you feel scared or uncomfortable? Oliver's eyes filled with tears. For so long, he had held everything inside, afraid that no one would understand. But now, sitting in front of his teacher, he felt like the secret was too heavy to carry anymore. He had to tell someone. It's my grandma, he whispered. She touches me in bad ways. She tells me it's a secret, and I can't tell anyone. Mrs. Jack's face grew serious, but she stayed calm. Thank you for telling me, Oliver, she said softly. You're very brave. I'm going to help you, okay? You don't have to be scared anymore. Oliver nodded, tears spilling down his cheeks. He felt both scared and relieved. For the first time, he had told someone the truth. Maybe now things would change. Later that day, the school contacted Child Protective Services. When the social workers arrived, they spoke to Oliver gently, asking him about what had been happening. Oliver told them everything. He talked about the nights at his grandmother's house, how she made him keep her terrible secret, and how scared he had been to tell anyone. The social workers listened carefully, taking notes and asking questions to make sure they understood what Oliver was saying. They didn't rush him or make him feel like he was wrong. Instead, they reassured him that he had done the right thing by telling them the truth. Once the investigation began, the truth quickly started to unfold. The social workers visited Oliver's home and spoke to his parents, who were completely unaware of the nightmare their son had been living. At first, they were confused and didn't want to believe it. How could this happen in their own family? How could someone they trusted, like Grandma James, do something so terrible? But when the doctors examined Oliver, they found signs of the abuse. There were scars on his body that told a story he had kept hidden for far too long. His parents were shocked and heartbroken. They had been so busy with work, so focused on making money and building their careers, that they hadn't noticed the pain their son was going through. Oliver's father, Mr. Peter, sat down in disbelief. How could we not see this? He asked. How could we have let this happen? Mrs. Peter wept, clutching her son's hand. She felt guilty for leaving him with his grandmother so many times, for not listening when he tried to tell them that he didn't want to go. The social workers promised that they would do everything to keep Oliver safe. They explained that his grandmother would be investigated and that Oliver would no longer have to visit her. Oliver felt a mixture of relief and sadness. He was glad that he had told the truth, but part of him still worried about what would happen next. For the first time in a long time, Oliver didn't feel alone. He had finally found his voice, and now people were listening. The days after Oliver's confession felt like a whirlwind of emotions. While his parents struggled to come to terms with the horrific truth, the authorities wasted no time in investigating Grandma James. It wasn't long before the police arrived at her house, knocking on her door with stern faces. At first, Grandma James tried to act innocent. "What is the meaning of this?" she asked, her voice trembling with false concern. "Why are you here?" But the police had already gathered enough evidence. They knew about the scars on Oliver's body, and they had his testimony. Despite her wealth and social standing, Grandma James couldn't escape the truth. She was taken into custody, and the community was left in shock. No one had suspected that someone like her, an elderly, respected woman, could commit such a horrible crime. As the investigation deepened, more dark secrets about Grandma James came to light. It turned out that Oliver wasn't her first victim. There had been other children, young boys, who had been too scared to speak up. They had suffered in silence, just like Oliver had, believing no one would believe them if they told the truth. The news spread quickly, and people in the village whispered in disbelief. How could this happen? One neighbor asked. She always seemed so kind, another murmured, shaking their head. Who knew she had such darkness in her heart? For Oliver, the arrest of his grandmother brought both relief and sadness. He no longer had to face the fear of going to her house, but it hurt to know that someone he had once called family had caused him so much pain. His parents, overwhelmed with guilt, tried their best to comfort him, but Oliver still felt the weight of everything that had happened. The court case that followed was swift. With the overwhelming evidence of her abuse, Grandma James was found guilty of all charges. She was sentenced to spend the rest of her life in prison. The judge, looking at her with disgust, spoke firmly. "You have caused unspeakable harm to innocent children," the judge said. "Your actions were cruel and unforgivable. For that, you will spend the remainder of your days behind bars." As the gavel struck, sealing her fate, Oliver's parents sat in the courtroom, holding their son close. They had failed to protect him, and now they had to live with the consequences of their neglect. The guilt weighed heavily on them, especially for Mr. Peter. He remembered all the times Oliver had tried to tell them he didn't want to go to Grandma's house, and how they had brushed it off as nothing important. After the trial, the social workers sat down with Oliver's parents to discuss his future. Given their past neglect, the authorities were concerned about Oliver's well-being. The fact that they had been too focused on their careers to notice the signs of abuse troubled them deeply. "We understand that you love your son," one of the social workers said gently, "but we have to make sure that he is in a safe and supportive environment. Right now, it's clear that you've been too busy with work to give him the attention he needs." Oliver's mother, Mrs. Peter, began to cry. "We didn't mean for this to happen," she sobbed. "We love our son. We thought we were doing what was best for him by providing a good life. But you weren't there when he needed you the most," the social worker replied softly, "and because of that, Oliver has suffered terribly." In the end, the judge ruled that Oliver would be placed in the care of a loving foster family. His parents, though devastated, had to accept the decision. They had been given a chance to protect him, but their neglect had allowed the abuse to go on for years. Now, Oliver would be living with a family that could give him the attention and love he so desperately needed. Oliver's new foster parents were kind and gentle. They welcomed him into their home with open arms, making sure he felt safe and loved from the very first day. Unlike his old life, where his parents were too busy to notice him, Oliver's new family made him feel like he mattered. They listened when he spoke, asked how he was feeling, and comforted him when memories of his past haunted him. As the weeks passed, Oliver slowly began to heal. His nightmares became less frequent, and the fear that had once gripped his heart started to loosen its hold. His new parents made sure he saw a therapist regularly, helping him process everything he had been through. They taught him that it wasn't his fault, and that he was brave for speaking up. One day, as Oliver sat in his new room, surrounded by books and toys, he realized something. For the first time in a long time, he felt free. The dark cloud that had hung over him for years had finally lifted. The memories of his grandmother's house would never fully disappear, but they no longer had the power to control him. At school, Oliver made new friends and even began to excel in his studies. His teacher, Mrs. Jack, noticed the change in him. He smiled more, laughed more, and seemed like a different boy from the quiet, withdrawn child she had once known. "You've grown so much, Oliver," she said one day after class. "I'm so proud of you." Oliver smiled shyly. "Thank you, Mrs. Jack. I'm just happy now." As the months passed, Oliver's parents visited him regularly. Though they were no longer his primary caregivers, they had learned from their mistakes. Each time they saw him, they promised to do better, to always listen, and to never let work come before their son again. In the end, Oliver's story served as a powerful reminder to the community. Parents everywhere became more mindful of who they left their children with and started paying closer attention to their children's needs. The school also made sure to bring in more guest speakers like Mrs. A, ensuring that all children knew they had a voice, and that there were adults who would listen and help them if they were ever in trouble. As for Oliver, he continued to grow and heal, knowing that his bravery had saved not only himself but possibly others as well. He had found his voice, and through that, he had found his freedom.